The wind was hungry that autumn, snapping through the high ridges like a starving thing. It stripped the aspens to bone and sent the deer down early from the mountains. Frost came sudden and stayed, hardening the ground and the hearts of men alike. And in that wind, near a crook in the Bitterroot River where no one had passed in weeks, a horse collapsed under its rider and did not rise. The man slid free just in time, boots striking the frozen bank. He fell to his knees, breath rattling in his chest. Blood darkened the wool of his coat at the shoulder, and another patch stained his side. The river whispered beside him, indifferent. He stayed upright a moment longer, eyes locked on nothing, and then he went down. The gelding groaned once, shallow and spent, and all fell quiet again. She saw the buzzards first. 3 days prior, Ellen Brant had passed through that same bend on her way to check the trap lines she set further up the valley. She lived alone in a sod-roofed cabin her father had built a decade before his lungs gave out, and she had not spoken to another soul in 16 weeks. Not unless you counted the dogs or the mare she rode, and some nights she did. Ellen was not yet 30, but wore the stillness of a woman older, one who had known how to hold her own long enough for softness to seem like a foreign tongue. Her life had narrowed to survival and silence. She slept with a rifle within arm's reach. She did not dream. When she spotted the circling birds, she expected to find a carcass or a snare gone wrong. What she found instead was a man, half buried in snowmelt and leaves, his skin gray-blue, lips cracked open like dry wood. His horse was dead beside him, its belly already opened by a coyote or worse. She nearly turned back. But something caught. In his hand, barely visible, was a folded scrap of canvas. He had been trying to cover himself even as he lost strength. There was no fire pit, no trail, no pack, just blood and the kind of weariness a man doesn't fake. She knelt beside him and felt his neck. The pulse was there, thready and weak. His face was sharp-featured, though the beard masked some of it, and his clothes were tailored beneath the grime. Not a trapper, not a ranch hand. She did not know what he was, but it was clear he had no business being out here. Not like this. Ellen dragged him over the saddle of her mare with effort that left her shaking, teeth clenched so hard her jaw ached for hours after. She took only what she could carry in one hand, left the dead horse and the rest to the wild. The dogs stayed close, ears twitching, noses wary. That night she boiled water over the stove and stripped the man's coat away. The wound in his side was deep but not fresh. Someone had dressed it poorly and too long ago. Infection had taken hold. Fever radiated off him in waves. He didn't wake when she cleaned it again, nor when she poured liquor between his lips and stitched the torn edge of his skin with trembling fingers. But he breathed. He stayed in and out of the dark for 5 days, spoke in half-formed words, sometimes in English, sometimes in something else, and once shouted a name she didn't recognize. He flinched from touch, but he lived. Ellen didn't ask why he was out there, not at first. She told herself it didn't matter. The cold would have killed him if she hadn't come through. That was all there was to it. She had done what anyone with a conscience and a cabin would have done. On the 6th morning, as the fire hissed and the snow gathered at the corners of the windows, he opened his eyes. His gaze met hers, sharp and startling. The fever had broken, but something raw still lived behind his stare. "Where am I?" he asked, voice like gravel dragged across stone. Ellen, crouched by the stove, did not rise. "You're lucky," she said, "and west of nowhere." His eyes flicked to the ceiling beams, then to the stitched wound beneath the bandage on his ribs. His hand drifted there slowly, as if confirming he was still whole. "Who are you?" he asked. She stood and poured broth into a tin cup, crossed the room, and set it in his reach. "Name's Ellen," she said. "Don't think that's the question you meant to ask." He didn't answer, but when she turned to leave, his voice followed. "I owe you." She paused, hand on the doorframe, and looked back at him, this man with city hands and eyes like a frost-bitten hawk. There was a weight in his voice she couldn't name, not yet, but it sat heavy in the room between them. "No," she said, quiet. "You don't, not unless you mean to pay with answers." He said nothing more that day. Outside, the wind kept screaming. He did not give her his name the next morning, nor the one after. But he stayed awake longer, drank what she gave him, and watched her move through the space like he was learning the world anew through her shape within it. The cabin was small, but every inch held a purpose. Hooks on the wall bore smoked meat and hides. A Bible rested beneath a stack of worn letters, their edges curling from years of rereading. Ellen did not speak often, but when she did, it was plain and steady. She gave orders like she expected them to be followed, not out of pride, but from the simple understanding that life out here left no room for half measures. He listened, that surprised her. On the 8th day, while she was gutting a rabbit near the hearth, he said, "You live alone." Ellen nodded without looking up. "Why?" She wiped her blade on a rag. "Because it's quieter." "Not safer." "No," she said, "but quiet's worth something." She could feel him watching her, weighing the answer. He didn't speak again until she'd hung the meat to dry and turned toward the door. "I was shot in the back," he said then. "Two men took my satchel, left me there." Ellen leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "What was in the satchel?" He hesitated. "Something I thought I could trade for peace." That earned her attention. She studied him for a long beat, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You look like a man who's had enough peace to last him." He didn't argue. Later, when the sun set behind the ridges and cast long gold shadows through the window panes, he asked for her name again, as if to anchor himself. She gave it just as before. This time he said, "Call me Calder." She repeated it once, low under her breath. He watched her lips move, and something softened behind his eyes. The days stretched. Calder regained his strength slowly, though he moved with the stiffness of a man accustomed to being in command, not convalescing. His hands, though clean and unscarred, held a tension that betrayed long years of making hard decisions. And while he never mentioned the world he'd come from, Ellen could feel it pressing around the edges of his silence like a ghost waiting to be named. He began to help where he could, fetching water, splitting wood in crooked lines. The dog circled him warily at first, but warmed in time. One afternoon, he asked to ride the mare just to feel her gait again. Ellen allowed it, though she kept the rifle in sight. When a storm swept down from the north and buried the trail markers in snow, Calder sat beside her by the stove and peeled an apple with surprising precision. He handed her a slice, then kept his eyes on the knife. "I had a company once," he said. Ellen chewed slowly. "What kind?" "Mining, transport. Half the territory ran on what we pulled from the ground." She raised an eyebrow. "Ran," he said again, bitter, past tense. She said nothing, letting the weight of that word settle. "It wasn't enough," he continued. "Gold buys loyalty until someone offered more. I made enemies, trusted the wrong men. That's not hard to do." Calder looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing the echo of his own ruin in the calm quiet of her face. "What about you?" he asked. "Why here, why alone?" Ellen leaned back in the chair, the fire painting her features in warm tones that did not quite reach her eyes. "Because the world out there takes everything and says thank you for the privilege." He nodded, understanding without needing further explanation. Winter thickened. The days grew shorter, the dark more absolute. Calder stayed, though he no longer needed to. Each morning he chopped wood as if it would buy him one more night under her roof. Ellen let him, not because she needed the help, but because his presence no longer felt like intrusion. Still she waited for the part where he'd vanish the way others had, or where his past came calling and blood was the price of harboring it. It came on a still morning, frost glittering like broken glass across the clearing. Ellen was hanging pelts when she saw the riders. Two of them, clean-shaven, dressed finer than the season called for, rifles slung easy across their backs. They did not smile. Calder stepped onto the porch behind her, face gone tight. "Friends of yours?" she asked. "No," he said. "They're what comes after." Ellen didn't blink. "Then I hope you still know how to shoot." Ellen moved before the riders reached the gate. Her rifle rested in her arms like it belonged there, her stance unbothered but ready. Calder stayed beside her, silent, his jaw locked like stone. The men dismounted without invitation. One was tall and thin with eyes like wet ash. The other carried himself with the lazy menace of someone who had drawn blood before breakfast. They wore matching gloves and long coats lined with satin. The thin one tipped his hat toward Ellen. "Beggin' your pardon, ma'am, we're lookin' for a man traveled this way. Goes by Calder Lane." "I don't know him," Ellen said flatly. The other one smiled, slow and humorless. That's so. She didn't blink. Folks don't come this way without reason, and they don't stay without mine. Calder stepped forward then, not enough to place himself between them, but close. Let her be, he said. The tall man turned toward him like a hound catching a scent. There he is. Ellen raised the rifle a hair. You shoot one, the other kills you, Calder said low, without fear. They're not here to ask nicely. I figured, she replied. The one with the mean smile took a step closer. We don't want trouble. Then you should have kept riding. Mr. Lane, the thin one said, ignoring her now. You left something behind, ledger, deed, books. That kind of thing don't just vanish. Our employer, he's particular about loose ends. I'm not a loose end, Calder said, and I burned what I couldn't carry. That's unfortunate, the man said, because he aims to rebuild, and he needs what you took. Calder's voice dropped to something darker. He can rot in the hole he dug for me. The silence that followed stretched too long. Ellen cocked the rifle. The two men looked at her again. Their eyes passed over her calloused hands, the wolfhound seated at her hip, the steadiness in her breath. Then they looked back at Calder, calculation thick between them. You've made a friend, the tall one said at last. No, Calder replied. I've found someone who doesn't lie. The riders didn't press further, not that day. They mounted their horses, left a warning in the churned snow of their tracks, and vanished into the timber like smoke. But Ellen knew better than to think it was over. That night Calder took down one of the spare rifles from her wall and cleaned it by firelight. He moved like a man who'd once commanded armies, or something close enough. When he spoke, his voice was low and certain. I can't stay. You can, Ellen said, but not without cost. I've already brought it to your door. Then we're past the choosing. Calder looked up. The flames caught his face, casting hard lines and deep shadows, but there was something else too, something wounded. They'll come again, he said. I know. And you'll fight with me. I've fought for less. He nodded slowly, as if her words were something rare he didn't dare take lightly. Then softer he asked, why? Ellen's gaze didn't waver. Because I don't trust men who come clean, but I trust the ones who bleed and stay. After that, things shifted. Calder no longer moved like a guest. He took to patrolling the ridgeline at dawn, repaired the corral, mended the chimney stones that cracked in the cold. He spoke little still, but when he did, there was a warmth that hadn't been there before, like a man thawing from the inside out. Ellen watched him with a kind of careful distance. She wasn't softened by gratitude. She'd been alone too long to romanticize the way he chopped wood or fixed the harness. But his presence didn't weigh. It steadied. One evening, after the thaw began and the ground gave off the sweet rot of earth waking, Calder brought her a small bundle wrapped in wax paper. What's this? She asked. From my coat, he said. I meant to trade it, but it's better here. She unwrapped it slowly. Inside lay a necklace, silver, thin and oddly shaped, with a coin pressed flat at the center. It was old, not showy, not cheap. Ellen turned it over in her fingers. Yours. My mother, Calder said. She told me it'd protect me from my worst choices. You keep it, then. I already made mine, he said, and there was no jest in it. Ellen said nothing. She slipped the chain around her neck, tucked it beneath her collar, and went back to her stitching. The moment settled between them, unspoken but solid. And that night, long after she'd doused the lantern, Calder didn't return to the spare cot. He lay beside her in silence, bodies just inches apart, not touching. His breath steady, hers calm, no words, no promises. Only the quiet hum of two lives beginning to share their shape. Spring came slow to the high country. Ice retreated from the riverbanks in ragged strips, and the trees, long bare and bowed, began to whisper again with the wind. Ellen planted onions behind the cabin while Calder built a second stall for the mare. Neither spoke much of what had passed that winter, but the space between them had changed. It held weight now, familiar and unhurried, like the hush between waves. The trouble, though, had not gone. Trouble never leaves the wilderness. It only quiets for a time. Calder woke early that May morning, boots already laced when Ellen stirred from sleep. He stood by the window, shoulders tense, eyes fixed on something outside. She rose and joined him, brushing hair from her face. "They're back," he said. Two figures on horseback, not the same men as before, but the look was near enough, slick coats, clean hats, expressions too calm to be honest. They were making no effort to hide their approach. That was the part that unsettled her most. Ellen pulled on her coat. Calder handed her the rifle before she asked. The men stopped at the gate, one holding a folded letter aloft like it might shield him from what he was riding into. The lead one, a barrel-chested man with sharp cheeks and polished boots, tipped his hat when they stepped onto the porch. "Good morning to you," he called. "We bring word from the east. Mr. Lane's affairs have drawn considerable attention." Ellen didn't respond. Calder stepped forward, eyes locked with the stranger's. "You can speak it here." The man cleared his throat. "Mr. Barron extends an invitation. He's rebuilding the charter. He says your seat remains open should you return it with proper restitution." Calder didn't move. "Barron sent men to kill me." "That was a misunderstanding." "That was a bullet in my back." The second rider spoke then, voice lower. "You were his closest partner, Lane. He doesn't want a feud. He wants a future." Calder's voice was quiet, sharp as flint. "He should have thought of that before he turned my signature into a death sentence." The man with the letter shifted in his saddle. "We don't come looking for war, but if you stay hidden out here, people will come who don't ask as nicely." Ellen stepped down from the porch then, rifle still in her hands. "You're not half as polite as you think," she said, "and I've buried worse than you behind this cabin." The lead man looked between them, assessing. Then he nodded once tight. "You've been warned." They turned and rode out without looking back. That night Calder sat by the fire, his hands stained from oil and timber, staring into the flames. Ellen stitched a tear in her coat, quiet beside him. "They won't stop," he said. "No," she agreed. "If I went back." "You wouldn't come back." He met her gaze, searching for something. "I built an empire," he said, voice low, "piece by piece, then I burned it." Ellen leaned back in her chair. Maybe it needed burning. He let that sit a while. "Barron will come himself next," he said, "or someone worse." Ellen nodded. "Then we prepare." And they did. For 3 weeks they worked in tandem like they'd done it a lifetime. Calder fortified the outbuildings, buried supplies, mapped blind turns and old game trails. Ellen set traps beyond the southern ridge, the kind meant not to catch but to maim and warn. They trained the dogs to recognize scent markers. They practiced shooting not for show, but for time and truth. Yet through it all, they kept the rhythm of ordinary life. Ellen still knelt in the soil each morning, fingers curled around the green shoots she coaxed from the earth. Calder still split wood with care, stacking it neat along the wall. They spoke little of what waited beyond the trees, but their bodies never strayed far from each other. One dusk, as thunder rolled distant over the peaks, Ellen stepped inside to find Calder at the small table, scribbling on a worn scrap of parchment. She crossed to him, her shadow long in the lamp light. "What's that?" "My will," he said, folding it clean, "should something happen." Her jaw clenched. "It won't." "But if it does." She cut him off with a glance hard but not unkind. "Then it dies with you." He looked up at her, something close to awe flickering across his face. "You'd bury it all?" he asked. "I've buried worse." He reached for her hand then, fingers calloused but careful. "And if I asked you to leave it all behind?" She didn't answer at first. Her thumb brushed the coin necklace at her throat, the one he'd given her without strings. Then, quiet as snow falling on a tin roof, she said, "Not until it's finished." And Calder Lane, once the master of cities and ledgers, said nothing more. He simply held her hand as the night deepened around them and the storm crept closer. The rain broke in the night, sudden and relentless, hammering the tin roof like fists. Thunder rolled heavy over the ridgelines, and the dogs growled low from the hearth, uneasy. Ellen rose without a word, moved to check the latches on the windows, the lantern wick, the rifles. She'd known storms before, but this one carried something sharper than water in its wake. Calder didn't sleep either. He sat on the edge of the bed, boots laced, shoulders taut. His breath was steady, but his eyes stayed fixed on the shadows. At first light the wind fell still, not quiet still, a silence so complete the world seemed to hold its breath. Ellen stepped onto the porch with the rifle slung across her shoulder. Calder followed. There were no birds. The trap line had been sprung, twice. By mid-morning they found prints, new ones, less than a half-day old. 4 men, heavy horses, no wagons, too silent to be any patrol. They're near, Ellen said, crouched by the track. Calder scanned the tree line. This time, they're not coming to talk. They didn't return to the cabin. They took the long way around, through the eastern draw and up the high slope where the aspens grew thin and the rocks gave good cover. Calder carried a shotgun slung low. Ellen kept her rifle close, her eyes sharper than the wind. By the time they reached the overlook, the intruders were already in sight. 4 riders, one was Baron. Even from a distance, Calder's breath caught. The man had aged, his hair silvered, his stance broader, but the arrogance hadn't dimmed. He rode like the world owed him its shape, and he was here to collect. They'll burn the cabin, Calder said, then smoke us out. They won't get the chance. It wasn't bravado. Ellen's voice held none of that, just the solid weight of intent. They waited, let the men draw nearer, watched the cabin from the trees. Baron dismounted last slowly, like he was on holiday. He circled the clearing once before gesturing. That's when Ellen moved. She took the first shot with clean precision. One of the men dropped, struck hard in the thigh. The rest scattered, not like soldiers but like businessmen unfamiliar with the sharp edge of survival. Calder moved with her, flanking low through the brush, sweeping behind their position. The second shot came from him, not as graceful but no less effective. Another man fell, this time howling. They didn't kill them, not yet, but they made themselves known. Baron didn't run. He turned slowly and faced the trees. His voice rang clear. Lane, you mean to die in the dirt with your mountain bride. Calder stepped into the clearing, the shotgun lowered but ready. I mean to end this. Baron smiled like he'd expected as much. You always were too proud to bend. No, Calder said. I just learned what not to kneel for. Ellen emerged beside him, silent and sure, her rifle pointed with perfect calm. You came to kill me, Calder said, but you brought your name instead of a gun. Baron's smile faded. You think hiding in the wild makes you righteous, Baron spat. You think you found some redemption. I found something better than redemption, Calder said. I found someone who never needed it. Baron reached for his sidearm. Ellen shot first. His gun hand exploded red before it ever cleared the holster. He went down screaming, crawling backward like a man who'd never begged before and didn't know how. The last man ran, they let him. When it was done, when the echoes faded and the wind returned, Calder stood over Baron, who wept into the dirt, clutching what was left of his hand. There's no empire left, Calder said. You buried it when you buried me. Ellen didn't speak. She turned and walked back toward the cabin, leaving the rest to rot. That night they burned the ledgers. The documents Calder had once hoarded in secret, deeds, bonds, bank slips, one by one into the flames. He watched the ink curl and vanish, watched the past turn to smoke. Ellen came to him after, her hands rough and warm. She laid her head against his chest, and for a long time neither of them spoke. It was not victory, it was survival. But sometimes that was the only kind that mattered. Summer came slow but certain, each day blooming longer than the last. The river ran full with snowmelt, singing past its banks. The earth softened. Shoots of green curled through the ash beside the cabin where fire had licked the grass but left the walls standing. Ellen mended a new fence. Calder planted herbs he could not name but wanted to learn. Baron did not die. They left him where he fell, without weapon or pride, a warning in his own ruin. His name vanished from the land like mist. What men once whispered with respect now carried a note of disgust. Rumors reached the settlements of his failure, of the man who'd walked away from gold and power and come back with nothing but a wound and a woman who never once bowed to him. Calder wore no title anymore. He wrote no ledgers. But when the first passing ranchers came through, months later, and asked where to find safe shelter, the maps began marking a new name near the northern hills, Brant's Crossing. It started with a stray boy. thin, sunburnt, dragging a lame mule and eyes too old for 15. Ellen found him by the ravine, shaking with cold in the heat. She gave him water. Calder rode 2 days to fetch medicine. The boy stayed, quiet, grateful, good with animals. He helped stack wood, then stayed through the first frost. Then came a widow with her infant, then 2 brothers fleeing a debt, then a Lakota couple with nothing left but a wagon and the bones of a better life. Ellen never called it a homestead, but by winter, 7 souls slept within sight of her fire. They built lean-tos and cleared fields. Calder took to teaching what he remembered of contracts, of lumber rights and trail routes. He showed them how to read a deed so they'd never be swindled. Ellen showed them how to survive. She still didn't speak much, but people listened when she did. By the 2nd year, they had a sawmill. A schoolhouse followed. Just 1 room and a chalkboard, but Calder carved the benches by hand, and Ellen strung old lace for curtains. They never spoke of love, not in words, but each day began and ended in the same rhythm. The clink of tin mugs passed between them, her hand on his shoulder when he bent too long at work, the way he brushed the dirt from her sleeves with reverence. Sometimes at dusk, they stood on the porch together, watching the smoke rise from 6 chimneys beyond their own. The world he once ruled felt far away now, more myth than memory. Here, among the sound of hammers and children laughing in fields that once held only silence, he'd built something better. He'd built it from her. One night, long after the last frost and the first fireflies, Calder reached into a tin box buried beneath the floorboards. Inside was a strip of linen, still stained faintly with the blood from that long winter when she'd stitched him back to life. He gave it to her without a word. Ellen took it, folding it neatly, then slid it into the drawer beside her knife and the small book of seeds she never let anyone borrow. "You carry pieces of dying men," he said. She nodded, "and they carry pieces of me." Outside, an owl called low from the woods. Calder stepped close. "I don't want to be remembered for what I owned or what I lost." "You won't be," she said. "You'll be remembered for what you stayed for." He looked at her then, like a man seeing daylight for the first time. She didn't smile, but her hand found his, and that was enough. They never left the valley. But the name Calder Lane once carried, sharp, cold, gilded, found a second life in stories told beneath lantern light. And every one of them ended not with fortune or ruin, but with the woman who pulled him from the edge of death and taught him how to live again. Not a queen, not a prize, but the heart of the empire he built with his own hands, from ash and kindness, from quiet and fire.